Welcome to this blitzy question and answer session. Quite a few Polish people. Actually, we have a small but not infinitesimal Polish demographic actually watching the channels. This is one version of the question. In the light of people's rash responses to the missile explosion in Poland, are there some people who you agree with on the war who you wouldn't want to speak to? On principle, no. I am very open about who I'm happy to speak to. So I might not speak to people because my health doesn't give me the time to do that often enough or to even network, and I always prefer to speak with you instead. But that circle for me is wide, and I don't even believe actually in good faith conversations. I am also very open to having mixed faith conversations. But rather than just talking about sort of trash and dirt and people's Twitter accounts, let's just put a couple of broad principles on the table that take us beyond this war and into broader considerations of motivation, really, in politics. There's two things that are really important to understand generally. One is that virtually nothing large-scale and good would get done in the world if good could only be done by people acting with good intent. Yeah, almost all the greatest human achievements historically, as long as they're not individual achievements, were produced by a combination of different kinds of motives. Good motives, ill motives, mixed motives. So whenever there's a right side on an issue that one might want to be on, a lot of people inevitably are going to be on that side for admirable motives and for motives that are a bit crappy. So that's one thing that's important. And the second thing that's important is just what we've implied, that that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a human thing, and we've got to deal with it. There's going to be beauty and there's going to be crap. Now, a related question: did Zelensky lie about the missile explosion in Poland when he, contrary to the seeming international consensus forming, rejected the consensus? Now, what Zelensky said actually wasn't completely unequivocal, but it was certainly tilting in the direction of this wasn't us. If something has changed in the last few hours that I'm not aware of, my apologies, but the structure of the issue remains the same. Not my wheelhouse to comment on the military story, and even not my wheelhouse to comment on what that strategy is, and what kind of conversations Zelensky and Zaluzhny would have had about this. But I think at the level of political analysis of Western public response, we can clearly say that to Western citizens, Zelensky looks like he's pulling a Putin-esque trick. Now, that does depend. Whether that's a sustained view depends on perhaps something else coming out that we're not aware of. But roughly speaking, that trick Zelensky pulls is unimpressive to citizens in Western democracies because it looks Putin-esque. Comment on the MH17 judgment. Look, there's too much to say. So just a very big picture comment has got to be that it's an extraordinary cultural achievement for us to not just say, this is what we clearly know happened, this is our political position about it, but to have a different standard of proof and procedure that was applied in a very special and magical way over a very long period of time. And that's in complete contrast with the sort of politics that's being offered up by Russia at the moment, this extraordinary procedural soundness. And that's a very precious cultural achievement that also, I think, psychologically is going to bring a lot of victims partial peace and partial closure that could never come from just a general certainty of us anyway knowing what happened. That's quite apart from, compensation, this business of peace and closure. So that it offers us something very special that goes beyond, has Elliot Higgins and have all of these other people showing us clearly what happened. Yes, they have, on we go. This is special, and at the moment there's a very, very big, if you like, divide in political culture between the image of this extraordinary legal process and the sort of stuff the Russians are coming up with. Where is Girkin? Girkin is somewhere where he is not able to speak to the culture as much as he used to before, and that's because some people don't like how much he was speaking to the culture. I wouldn't connect that too directly with the judgment that he received. Do you think you overestimate the importance of Russia or any country processing its history? Distinction. There is such a thing as a culture having quite a healthy sense of transparency. If you like the visual arts, for example, and you go and look at the works of Anselm Kiefer, he offers us Westerners and Europeans and Germans an extraordinary set of imaginative resources to attain transparency with where one's come from without being broken by seeing all of it. So that's incredibly important, and an asphyxiation of that is catastrophic for cultures. But there's a difference between that and history becoming the central device through which politics, political discourse is driven by a government. Any government anywhere in the world, if it frames contemporary issues too much in historical terms, well, that's got to set alarm bells off in your head. In other words, there is something to the thought that the problem isn't just that Putin's historical delusions are delusions. It's also that level of obsession with history, even if he had a much more truthful account of it, would suggest something very, very deeply wrong. If Rishi Sunak, the British Prime Minister, started giving us lectures ongoingly about Britain's historical role, and that was the main thing he was talking about, I would say, who is this junior cardiologist who doesn't know anything about history talking to me about history? Do your job instead. So there's such a thing as, this need for alarm bells to go off when your politicians are talking too much in historical terms. Are there Soviet people? Yeah, there are plenty of Soviet people. They're dying out. There's plenty of Soviet people. In the sense that there are people now who, let us say, were born in Kiev in 1950, and let's say they live in the West today, that'd be in the early 70s, and let's say they lived for the first 30 years of their life in Kiev, and you ask them, are you Ukrainian? The war might change how they feel, but putting that aside, they would say, no, I'm not Ukrainian or Russian, I'm Soviet. There are a lot of these people in Belarus now, many, many more than there are in Ukraine, because Ukraine has clarified its identity to a very good extent, not necessarily in an entirely healthy way, but nevertheless. And there's plenty of Soviet people in Russia, and they're real. You can't do anything about it because that's how they feel. It would be very weird for them to say that they are Belarusian Russian. They would say I'm Soviet, and so but you would say, well, where is your country then? Can you point me to the map? And they would say, no, it doesn't exist anymore. My country is an ex-country, and no, I don't feel any affiliation, any kind of civic affiliation with any of the countries that have been created on the Soviet space. So these people are there, but I would guess that you're talking about people pretty much born before 1970. So we're going to have them for a few decades, but in diminishing numbers. How are women's rights in Russia? Huge conversation. Horrendous. It's worth an episode, but I would say that the degree of internalization in Russian society of masculine intolerance of the feminine by women is shocking. So, I mean, we're talking about a society that's relative to us several generations back. Don't assume anything progressive, ideological here in what I'm saying, but it's horrendous how much prejudice against women is typically internalized by Russian women, including the younger generations, less so, but still very much including the younger generations, I'm afraid. Does Putin prefer Trump or DeSantis? He doesn't prefer individuals. What the set of fairly stable preferences of the Russian regime leads to is the idea that they want chaos and consequently absorption of the United States in its own domestic issues. So their ideal would be for Trump to absorb any toxicity that he doesn't have and DeSantis has and incorporate it if he goes on to win. And then for DeSantis, if he goes on to win too, absorb any of Trump's most toxic elements. So that's the sort of thing that they are looking for. So for instance, if Trump is low on pandemic culture wars and DeSantis is higher on this issue than Trump, the Russians would want Trump to absorb this from DeSantis. If Trump's big on stop the steal, they would want DeSantis to somehow absorb that more. And that's basically how it works. So there's a recent ad I noticed by the Democrats when Trump made his announcement. And it basically showed Trump talking about doing things and then showed Biden doing things instead of talking about doing things. And that's exactly the sort of ad that Russians wouldn't have liked, because what they would have wanted was a hysterical attempt to sort of show how Trump's going to end US democracy. So you see, they want these tensions to be maximized, to be feverish, existential. They wouldn't have liked Trump's announcement that he is running, because where was Stop the Steal in that? Where were other huge issues in that? Well, these issues were put aside because that was a presentation made to appeal to certain Republican elites. Trump might evolve from that. The Russians wouldn't have liked that. So basically, they like chaos, divisiveness, breakdown in trust, and they're capable of taking sides and, as it were, preferring candidates ongoingly, but that's not a product of loyalty. That's a product of sort of everyday contingent judgment about what creates the biggest mess. Has the demolition of monuments of Pushkin in Ukraine gone too far? My ethic is that I'm comfortable with Ukrainians not bothering to get Russia or Russian history right at this point, because they're being terrorized for absolutely no reason by this completely inadmissible neighbor. So the only conversation at the moment is what's healthy for Ukraine. And that way around, you could end up talking about getting Russia right again, because one question for Ukraine is how do you not get invaded again in 2030? But what I would say is this. Ukraine's got to reckon with some kind of a path of not de-Russification, but at least reckoning with the issue of de-Russification. And Ukraine has got to reckon with the issue of decommunization, de-Sovietization. And it would be very unwise for Ukraine to do this reckoning by borrowing Western cancel culture methods. You might think Western cancel culture methods is something that the intellectual dark web or the anti-democratic right have made up, and that there is no cancel culture as a serious concern in our polity, in our discourse. That would be a grave bit of misunderstanding. I'm going to talk about that another time. So the problem that Ukraine's got is that this is a very delicate conversation, because you cannot just say no to all things Soviet, for example, because you're going to end up canceling many of your own important historical figures, many important cultural developmental threads in Ukrainian culture. So how do you balance this? And it needs to be done delicately, with some kind of separation between, on the one hand, talking about Ukrainian civic nationalism and a Ukrainian identity formation, but on the other hand, talking about history truthfully, talking about where you've come from and the mess that that constitutes, without, for instrumental reasons, caricaturing it, because that's, in the end, while tempting to serve certain political projects, is going to be counterproductive. So that's the balance. I say this about the Soviet Union as somebody who is profoundly politically anti-Soviet, but being politically anti-Soviet is different to being historically anti-Soviet. You can't fully be historically anti-Soviet because that's where you've come from, partly, and you've got to reckon with that, even though, as I say, politically, I myself am slow to name positive things about the Soviet Union. Actually, when I'm asked to, the first thing I think of is actually children's programming and children's books and children's entertainment, which I do think is the one thing that they had in the Soviet Union that was incomparably superior, in my view, to the West. And you feel it. The last generation of children on the other side of the Iron Curtain you feel it with are children born in the early 80s or earlier. They just about caught it. And they had an imagination. You still feel it when you meet them. Doesn't matter whether they're from Russia or from Czech, just on the other side of the Iron Curtain. You feel that imagination that is less developed in Western kids. And you might say, well, what is going on here? Well, I think part of the answer is that certainly in Russia, the quality of stuff made for kids was absolutely extraordinary. But then we might dig deeper and say, well, what's that about? How did that happen? And then that's no longer a pretty story. And the truth is that there was so much talent that went into children's stuff because you couldn't do adult stuff without going to prison. So for instance, if my memory doesn't deceive me, and it doesn't matter if it does because the structure of the issue is the same, the most popular children's writer, Kornei Chukovsky, the Soviet period, was more or less told by Stalin in the late 20s, mate, you can choose death and writing for adults or life and writing for kids. There's a lot of talent went into kids' stuff because of the repressive totalitarian nature of the society. But anyway, so that's the kind of reckoning that needs to happen. In terms of particular demolition of stuff, I mean, look, let's take two paradigms and make it extreme. If Russian occupiers now bring some kind of statue of Pushkin and plonk it down in the middle of your town square, take that stuff down, smash it up. But if in 1910 some Ukrainian students pitched money together and bought a bust of Pushkin and they could put it in an academic institution, no, that would not be a culturally constructive enterprise to take that down. What it could be constructive to do is put a plaque next to it and say, well, Pushkin is this and that, but these are some other things we don't know enough. We don't talk about enough when it comes to Pushkin. And maybe we can write on that plaque that Pushkin had lots of really ugly, trashy, imperialistic views and trashy, imperialistic poetry that he wrote too. Okay, well, put that up. So I would say that it's got to be a piecemeal conversation. It shouldn't borrow Western cancel culture trends, and so far Ukraine's not doing well on that front. And it should distinguish civic nationalism and Ukraine discovering exploring an identity that contrasts with Russian stuff, but at the same time it also has to reckon with the fact that the historical mess of where one's come from is always complex, and if you try to purify it, you're going to end up bit by bit just cutting off your own limbs. You're going to get rid of most significant Ukrainian historical figures if you take the strict position that anything that reeks of the Russian Empire has to go. So that's my meandering for the moment. Let's talk soon.